Are some people simply naive? Are there various types of naivete? Is naiveness a matter of denial? Or could there be something completely different in certain cases, like a lack of proper words to sort out dangerous situations in general? For instance, before going camping, we might want to read up on how to camp, right? And I looked at a book once on camping, and there was a whole chapter on bears and how to protect yourself from a bear. Well, I suppose if we want to protect from certain dangers, we'd want to have terminology, and bears is one term about something that could be dangerous to us, right? Same regarding going for a hike and going around cliffs. It would naturally be a danger to get too close to the edge of a cliff, especially if there were no guardrail around it. The same if you're in a region of the world where there is quicksand. Wouldn't it be nice to know that there's a term to label this so that you don't want to step in the middle of quicksand? And same finally if you were in a certain country where there was once warfare and uncleared minefields. Wouldn't it be nice to have a word minefield, which there is, so that you can identify beforehand particular dangers, including not stepping in a minefield. We even have this, I think, with regard to television. If one has good values and is raising children, one might advise children especially to not watch certain programming. The word we might then use is junk TV or something to that effect. But how interesting then, I think, when it comes to people, that we seem to have a lack of words to define dangerous people or dangerous situations in connection with people that are respectful terms. Hence, in the book Feeling Good, which came out around 1980, about moods or depression, being bummed out, whatever you have it, by Dr. David D. Burns, a psychiatrist at the time, he was saying, amongst other things, don't label people. And the whole gist of cognitive therapy was your thoughts cause your emotions. And so as you think, so you feel. And we could feel pretty bad with the wrong words. I believe David Burns was talking about labels being terms, just like mathematical terms, that have built into them a descriptive component of danger sometimes, yes, or what some people would even call toxicity, but at the same time the terms also convey that the person is blameworthy in some fashion, and that should be hated. There's a hate component to most all of our words, I believe, in mankind, uncorrected to this time largely, and so to use a term often to sort people out is to often generate, or usually generate, a hate component, a blame component. So then, how interesting a problem here. If someone is empathetic, and I would just say, to simplify, empathetic people versus non-empathetic people, largely on how they were raised. Is an empathetic person going to want to use terms to sort out dangerous people, so to speak, versus non-dangerous people, or toxic people versus non-toxic people, in terms of toxic traits? Are they going to want to sort people out using terminology, i.e. words, or as David D. Burns called it, labels, that generate hate, blame, animosity, and so on, and that thus divide people. That doesn't seem to jive too well, does it, with empathetic person's core personality structure? So what happens? I believe all too often the empathetic person unconsciously decides, if you will, they'd rather not be able to sort people out and just kind of homogenize and see everybody as rather the same, and often idealizing people then, rather than saying the whole human race is terrible, which would make us feel so alone in the world. We'd rather thus, if not winnowing people, so to speak, or sorting people out, idealize the whole human race. Hence even Earl Nightingale from the 50s or more having said, everybody is basically honest, kind, loving people. Well, I find that, if you observe the world, rather hard to believe. So, as one person very dear to me used to tell me over the past few years, when I've started to try to sort traits in people out more and more, or the people thus who have the traits more and more, in general, I've repeatedly been told, you're too hard on other people. Well, how interesting, because this person is high in empathy and doesn't perhaps want to see certain people and their traits as to be not so desirable and to be kept at a distance or thought a lot about concerning how to deal with them. This person would rather get taken to the cleaners over and over and over, or as the word goes, be naive, and I would say only in a certain sense, not naive in other senses, than to have hatred, animosity, blame toward other people, these certain people in particular. Hence the term being naive. And then getting taken to the cleaners too. Some others might say, well, you deserve what you get, and you better wise up, or you're going to continue to get taken to the cleaners. Stop being so naive. But is it thus as simple as that? Because, case in point, George Carlin, the comedian, was renowned, as per an audiobook about him after his death, to have been a very gentle person in certain ways, a kind person, until a certain point. I think it was around 1970, the audiobook said. Then, all of a sudden, he developed what you might call a potty-mouth, and started a complete shift in his vocabulary describing certain people, a very more vehement sort of vocabulary set. His mother noticed that tremendously, and in one sense developed a lot of respect for him. You might say he lost his naivety about people, certain people, with respect to no longer homogenizing or seeing everybody the same, and basically choosing of a sort thus to see everyone all as saints rather than all as bad, if given the choice one way or the other, if you can't winnow people, so to speak. I say winnow because I was in a church service a couple years ago, and the pastor had talked of a biblical scripture of the necessity to winnow people, that being in one of the verses in the Bible. And furthermore, he then said, you need to sort good from evil. Well, I don't like the word evil, so what can I replace it with? If you would say that Dr. David Burns might say evil is a label, what are you going to replace it with? That some people are quicksand? I've thought of that term from time to time, but I can't seem to get validation from anyone else that we should describe certain people as quicksand and some people as saints. Without validation of terms we come up with that are not blameful or labels, it's rather hard to remember what we came up with and use it. No one else would even understand what we're talking about. Hence, we would have to be very verbose. So, some Christians might want to sort people into good and evil. But then, isn't it rather hateful generating to call certain people evil? I certainly wouldn't want to call a neighbor evil. That would invite a lot of blowback, shall we say, upon me. That would not be a word to use. Just like a former Secret Service person, Evie, and I don't remember her last name, it started with a P, advised that generally you not use the word lie when you're talking to someone else if they have in fact told you a mistruth. And she urged you to use other terms instead, and has shows on this about words in general, which ones to use and which ones not to. Lining up essentially, I believe, with Dr. David Burns saying don't label people, and Evie was trying to show what terminology to use that would be respectful and not generate blowback, thus be in your best interest and others too, and not be thus a label. When I was in the military, for instance, in my 20s, there was a individual, a major, who the rest of the people under him called the Shark. And in a movie, I think it was The Undiscovered Life, trying to remember the title for sure, with Robert Redford and Morgan Freeman. It was about a bear, but also more generally about certain people that we perhaps ought to consider as bears, at least until they might change. And that's sometimes being very difficult for what is the phrase? A leopard to change its spots? Or a zebra to change its stripes? It could possibly happen, but not often. But these then being terms more palatable, less likely to be called labels, per se, less likely by far to generate hatred and blame. The same might be said thus for getting too close to the edge of a cliff. We call it a cliff rather than an evil spot on a nature hike, right? Same goes for quicksand then too. Now, when I was in California, say in my early 20s or late 20s, after the military, I remember being told it's best to regard people, and basically all people, as, quote, dysfunctional. But isn't it interesting then that they had not said that some people are hugely dysfunctional with a capital D, and some people are dysfunctional with a little d. And the same for biblical scriptures saying that we are all sinners, when in fact Noah, Esau, perhaps Joseph, some others were considered, yes, sinners, but with a little s, whereas some others, including present-day Mr. Hitler and Stalin, big sinners. How are you going to winnow people then if you use disrespectful language to describe such people and not want to generate hate in your heart, blame, and of course blowback? What terminology would you use? Despot? I don't know. When in fact there are so many people of a sort like this to a minor level, comparatively speaking, a lower level, that we would get ourselves in a lot of hot water if we walked around all day long saying that somebody is a mini Hitler, or that they're a jackbooted such and such, or that they're a member of the Gestapo. So, those who criticize somebody for being naive often, I believe, are referring to this phenomenon, but generally we can't get a grasp on it, I believe. They're referring to some people, I believe, essentially preferring on a subconscious, unconscious level to not use terminology to sort the cliff from the non-cliff people, the quicksand people from the not quicksand people, the bears from the non-bears, or the Rottweilers from the golden retrievers. For if, let's say, you're blind and you go to the Blind Society, they would not assign you a Rottweiler as a seeing eye dog or companion dog. They'd generally assign you a golden retriever or something to that effect, a gentle dog. But we would not refer to the Rottweiler as an SOB, would we? But some people do use the word SOB and a variety of other terms to sort out what that word kind of refers to so that you can take appropriate action, at least in terms of being on the alert, so to speak, keeping your eyes wide open, one might say. If we lack words like evil or SOB and a whole host of others because we're too empathetic not to want to use these and thus experience the hate and blame and so on that it comes afterward, that I believe is called a form of naivety with a capital N. I think most other forms of naivety have to do much more with denial. Maybe to not use terminology that is hateful to sort people out is a denial of sorts, but in the service of not feeling hateful. So that, in my mind, is a different sort of bailiwick than to say denying some other aspects of reality that would not necessarily generate hate, but fear instead. Two different bailiwicks, two different types of naivety then. One generating hatred, if not chosen, so to speak. The other generating something completely different, if not used. In other words, to not deny certain aspects of reality, generating great fear. Two different kinds of naivety, or groups of naivety, thus, in my opinion. I'll close thus by giving an example without naming names of somebody in a local community that I know who has a leadership position in a business in the town. He is known as a very kind man, and yet his employees have told me he's a very naive man, that he has sometimes hired people that was not a good business decision. So my conjecture is that this man, amongst many, would prefer not to use terms which Dr. David Burns would call labels, that generate hate, animosity, blowback, and often get taken to the cleaners, than use terminology that would winnow or sort people out, but that he thus would lose his compassion, or, as it was said of George Carlin, develop a potty-mouth and sort people out much better, but with the added non-benefit of becoming much more angry. For if you would listen to this one audiobook, I think it might have been called Last Words, about George Carlin's life, we would see it described that there was an incredibly strong change in him around, I think, 1970, when he shifted his vocabulary. He became much more savvy about people and sorting them out in one respect, and yet overnight, so to speak, much more hateful, blameful, a different personality coming out entirely. Protecting himself in one sense much better, protecting his hide, so to speak, or his behind, but at the cost of losing a whole bunch of empathy towards others, so to speak, and a lot more blowback too. I say the same thing to close with an interesting writer of sorts in America in the past. I'm trying to remember when he passed away, maybe 5-10 years ago or more. Gore Vidal. And he had a grandfather, I believe, Thomas Vidal, who was a senator in Oklahoma. Gore Vidal was considered by some in the middle class to be an enigma, a mystery, because he describes so aptly, I believe, the moral condition of our country in certain respects, and yet at the same time was a very hateful man when describing certain people that he was talking about. I believe it's because his terminology was of the sort that happened to George Carlin after about 1970, able to sort out, quote, good and evil, or noxious versus not, quite well, and at the cost, though, of having a very caustic, cynical attitude, shall we say. Blameful, you might say, or the psychiatrist David Burns saying labels. To take away his use of labels would have likely taken away a great writer in a certain respect as describing toxic parts of our systems and certain people in them in our country. Hence, his having been described as an enigma or thorn in the side of the establishment. This, I believe, is a situation that has plagued mankind all eons, and such that some Buddhists tend to practice and urge other people to do something like non-thinking, or to basically blank out your mind and operate by intuition. John Brahm, a leading Buddhist today in Australia, heading up a monastery there of great repute, has in fact urged most people not to do much thinking unless they have a certain mindset that he would call basically being enlightened. Because he says culture gives us too many ideas that causes too many problems, and hence it's best not to think. He was basically, I believe, likely referring to thinking with the terminology we have at present, and use of it too much causing so much hatred and animosity in ourselves that certain leading Buddhists and others would prefer to do their thinking on an intuitive, non-word basis than to generate hatred. He would rather do what Dr. David Burns was urging, to not use labels. But if almost of our words to describe people, sort people out, are labels, then what are we left with but non-thinking, just, quote, sitting there and operating on an intuitive, internal level, subconscious level, if you will. That can be very problematic, I believe, and cause us to have to then live a much more isolated life to cope with the, quote, toxic persons of a society, and sometimes even toxic societies, if you will. Hence, some Buddhists entirely leaving certain countries because they find them intolerable and they can't deal with certain people there. They lack the words. Words in the sense they unconsciously or other, quote-unquote, choose not to use, and thus must isolate because they can't deal with certain parts of society, is my contention. I'd close with an interesting article or two I had seen a couple years ago on the internet, one on WikiHow, about writing your own dictionary. Well, I would say it might have been referring, or I interpret it as writing your own dictionary of what they call neologisms or words that are respect-based, not hate-based, but are not in any dictionary and no one else would really understand. But without such, we are in essence naive, I believe, in the capital N sense, and left rather like some Buddhists, having to do, quote, non-thinking, lest hatred be generated. Some people, highly empathetic, choose rather to not generate such hatred, but at the expense of not being able to sort certain people from other people, thus having to either retreat from society often or just plain zone out, with meditative practices not involving any thought process per se on a conscious level, or even to the extent of zoning out with some substance, whether it be marijuana, tranquilizers, or as some even do, psychedelics. They're urging that psychedelics help you get a greater grip on reality. Well, maybe in part because they might just help you zone out and see more on an intuitive level when, if we had proper words that were respect-based instead of label-based, this intuitive-only approach might not be necessary. That's my spin on this at present. And it is what I had talked about in part, but I've developed more in time since I wrote one book a couple years ago, very short little book, Treachery of Words in the Western World.